The invitation to my parents' 40th anniversary celebration arrived in a thick cream envelope with gold lettering. Inside was an equally elaborate card requesting the honor of your presence at the social event of the season, and a handwritten note asking me to please not mention my profession to any of the guests. I shouldn't have been surprised. Eleanor and Richard Morgan had spent 40 years carefully cultivating their image as old money socialites, despite having started with nothing. My career as a police detective didn't fit their preferred narrative of country club memberships and charity galas. Couldn't you have gone into corporate law like your sister? Mom would sigh whenever the subject came up. Or at least federal law enforcement. Local police work is so common. I'd learned to ignore their disapproval. I was good at my job, had made detective at 32, and had one of the highest case closure rates in the department. But to my parents, success only counted if it came with the right social connections. The final straw came a week before the party. I just closed a major fraud case involving several prominent local businesses. The press coverage was extensive, including photos of me leading the main suspect, who happened to be a member of my parents' country club, out in handcuffs. Mom called that evening, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Do you have any idea," she hissed, "how embarrassing it was to see my daughter splashed across the news like some common beat cop?" Margaret Winchester had to leave the club luncheon early. She was so upset about Charles's arrest. Charles Winchester was running a Ponzi scheme that wiped out people's life savings, I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "Including some of your friends from the club. That's not the point. We have a certain position to maintain. Your father and I have worked too hard to build our reputation to have you destroy it with this crusading." I heard Dad's voice in the background, then Mom's muffled response. When she came back on the line, her voice was ice cold. "Your father and I have discussed it. We think it's best if you don't attend the anniversary party. You're uninviting me from your anniversary celebration because I did my job." "We're protecting our family's reputation," she corrected. "The guest list includes some very influential people. We can't risk you embarrassing us with talk of criminal investigations and police work." "What should I tell people when they ask why I'm not there?" "We'll say you're away on business. It's better this way, Alexandra. You'll understand someday." But I didn't understand. Not really. My parents had started with nothing. Dad was a bank clerk, Mom a receptionist when they got married. Somehow, by the time I was in high school, we were living in a mansion and moving in a light social circles. They'd always attributed it to smart investments and hard work, but something about their sudden rise had never quite added up. Maybe it was my detective's instincts, or maybe just wounded pride, but after that phone call, I started digging. First into public records, property purchases, business registrations, tax assessments, then deeper into financial transactions, investment patterns, banking records. The more I looked, the more questions I had. The timing of their wealth accumulation coincided with a series of bank failures in the late 90s. Dad had worked at each of these banks just before they collapsed, always moving to a new position shortly before the problems became public. I reached out to contacts in white-collar crime, pulling old case files, following money trails that had gone cold decades ago. What emerged was a pattern so careful, so calculated, that it had escaped notice at the time. But there was something else, something recent. Large transfers to offshore accounts, property being liquidated quietly, assets being moved in ways that suggested preparation for a quick departure. They were planning to run. I was at my desk at the precinct, reviewing these transactions, when my partner Steve dropped a file in front of me. "You need to see this," he said quietly. "That offshore account you flagged, it just received another transfer. Big one. And I mean big." I opened the file and felt my blood run cold. The transfer had come from the charity foundation my parents ran, the one that handled donations for all their high society friends' pet causes. "They're not just running," I whispered. "They're stealing from their own charity. All those society friends they're so worried about embarrassing. They're about to wipe them out." Steve leaned against my desk. "The anniversary party's this weekend, right? Perfect cover. Get everyone together, play the gracious hosts one last time, then disappear with their money before anyone realizes what's happened." I stared at the invitation still sitting on my desk, its gold lettering catching the fluorescent light. All those years of caring about reputation, of building the perfect social image, it had all been groundwork for this final con. "What are you going to do?" Steve asked. I picked up my phone and dialed a familiar number. Mom, about the party. I know you don't want me there, but I think you should reconsider. After all, I smiled grimly, I have something very important to share with all your guests. My mother's response was exactly what I expected, instant capitulation wrapped in a thin veneer of grace. Of course you should come, darling, she said smoothly. Your father and I were just being overprotective. You know how we worry about your dangerous job. I could practically hear her mind working, calculating risks, planning how to control the situation. That had always been my mother's specialty, manipulation disguised as maternal concern. I'll be there, I promised. And don't worry about my job embarrassing you. I have much more interesting things to discuss with your guests. The Morgan family estate was lit up like a fairyland the night of the party. Hundreds of twinkling lights draped the gardens, champagne fountains sparkled on elegant buffet tables, and a string quartet played softly in a corner of the grand ballroom. I arrived early, dressed in the kind of elegant black evening gown my mother had always wanted me to wear. My badge and gun were concealed but present, a reminder of who I really was, not who they wanted me to be. Alexandra, Mom air kissed my cheeks, her designer dress rustling. You look lovely, darling. Though perhaps some pearls would have been nice. I brought something better than pearls, I replied, patting my clutch where my evidence files were hidden. Something all your guests will find fascinating. Her smile flickered for just a moment. Behind her, I saw Dad tense in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Now isn't the time for shop talk, dear, he said firmly. Don't worry, I smiled. I'll wait for the perfect moment. The guests began arriving, the elite of local society, all dripping in jewels and designer labels. I recognized many faces from my investigation files. Potential victims of my parents' final con. Their combined wealth about to be siphoned away through that offshore account. Margaret Winchester was there, still recovering from her husband Charles's arrest in my Ponzi scheme case. The irony of her attending another financial fraud in the making wasn't lost on me. My sister Catherine arrived with her husband, both looking uncomfortable. She was the only one who'd gotten a hint of what was coming. I'd warned her to move her assets out of our parents' charity foundation the week before. She hadn't asked why, but she'd done it immediately. Maybe she had suspicions of her own. The evening progressed according to my parents' careful script. Dinner was served, toasts were made, stories of their 40-year romance shared. Mom and Dad played their parts perfectly, the devoted couple who'd built their fortune through hard work and determination. I waited until dessert, when the champagne had loosened tongues and lowered guards. Dad was just starting his speech about family legacy and the importance of reputation when I stood up, tapping my glass for attention. I'd like to say something about legacy, I announced. About the true story of how my parents built their fortune. Alexandra, Mom's voice held a warning note. Perhaps this isn't the time. Actually, it's exactly the time, I continued. Before any more money is transferred offshore. Before the charity foundation is completely drained. Before you and Dad disappear with everyone's donations. The room went silent. Dad's face had gone pale, while Mom's bore the frozen smile she always wore when losing control of a situation. I don't know what you're talking about, Dad tried to laugh it off. The champagne must be going to your head. I opened my clutch and began laying out documents on the table. These are records of systematic fraud going back 30 years. Each bank failure that enriched you. Each investment scheme that mysteriously collapsed after you pulled your money out. And now, I turn to face the shocked guests. The charity foundation that's being drained as we speak. She's clearly confused. Mom stood up, still trying to maintain control. Too much work stress. Poor dear. Always so invested in her little police cases. Speaking of cases, I continued, I should mention that my colleagues are currently executing search warrants on your offices and the foundation headquarters, and freezing certain offshore accounts. The sound of breaking glass made everyone jump. Dad had dropped his champagne flute, his hands shaking visibly now. You don't understand, he said hoarsely. Everything we did was for this family, to give you girls the life you deserved. By stealing from other families? I challenged. By building a reputation on lies. Just so you could pull off this final con? How many lives were you willing to destroy for your legacy? Margaret Winchester had stood up, her face ashen. The foundation, my husband's restitution payments to his victims were in that foundation. Other guests began realizing the implications. the room erupting in confused questions and accusations. Mom's perfect party was dissolving into chaos. You can still fix this, I told my parents quietly. Return the money, turn yourselves in. Show some real concern for legacy instead of reputation. For a moment, I saw something crack in my mother's perfect facade. We didn't know how to stop, she whispered. Each lie required another lie. Each scheme had to be bigger than the last. We couldn't let anyone see what we really were. Common? I suggested. Like your daughter, the detective. Dad had sunk into his chair, decades of pretense finally falling away. I always admired your honesty, he said softly. Even when we criticized your choices, you were the only one of us brave enough to be real. The arrests were quietly handled. I'd made sure the officers waiting outside were discreet. No perp walk, no media circus. One final consideration for the reputation my parents had spent 40 years building. In the end, most of the money was recovered. The charity foundation was reorganized under new leadership, with Catherine ironically taking a role in its rehabilitation. She's determined to do things legitimately to build a true legacy of helping others. Mom and Dad took a plea deal. Their cooperation in recovering the funds and identifying other participants in their decades of fraud earned them lighter sentences. They'll still be in prison for years, but they'll have time to reflect on what real success means. I still have the anniversary invitation, its gold lettering now tarnished like the false image it represented. Sometimes I look at it and think about legacy, not the kind built on fraud and reputation, but the kind built on truth and justice. Yesterday, I closed another white-collar crime case. The perpetrator was another wealthy socialite, another pillar of the community. As I let her out in handcuffs, she sneered, "Don't you care about embarrassing your family?" I thought about my parents in their separate prison cells, about the lessons learned from 40 years of lies, about the choice between appearance and reality. My family, I told her, taught me the importance of reputation, but they also taught me, unintentionally, the greater importance of truth. Margaret Winchester called me this morning. The restitution funds from her husband's case, which my parents had nearly stolen, have been restored. She's using them to start a foundation that helps victims of financial fraud rebuild their lives. You could have protected your family's reputation, she said. Could have looked the other way. Why didn't you? The answer was simple. Because real legacy isn't built on reputation. It's built on doing what's right, even when, especially when, it's hard. I keep my detective badge on my desk now, not hidden away like my parents wanted. It's a reminder that success isn't measured in social status or charitable galas. Sometimes it's measured in small acts of justice, in choosing truth over appearance, in being proud of who you are rather than who others want you to be. Mom sent me a letter from prison last week. I finally understand, she wrote. All those years we spent building a false image, and our greatest achievement was the daughter we tried to change. Your reputation isn't what you pretend to be, it's what you actually are. It only took 40 years of lies and one dramatic anniversary party for them to learn that lesson.